Welcome to another episode of 30 Minutes in the New Testament. 30 Minutes in the New Testament is a 1517 Podcast Network podcast. You can go to 1517.org/podcast and check out all of the podcasts that are living over there. While you're over there, make sure you check out everything else that 1517 is doing. All those other videos, all the articles, the academies, the events. Our two 1517 events for this year are sold out, but there's a whole speakers network. I mean, who knows, Scott or Eric or even myself could have been like right in your backyard like last weekend and you wouldn't know.
You missed it.
Because you didn't go to the site, man. You didn't check out the list. You got to see if it's anywhere near you. So check out the Speakers Network and check out the events that different 1517 people are speaking at, and maybe you can go hang out with them. Also, since this is on YouTube, if you're listening on the podcast, thank you, and we appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, though, make sure that you hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. I'm really bad about telling you to do that, but helps us out. So go ahead and subscribe to that. Maybe even hit that notification bell so you get notified when we release these episodes.
Dan, I think you're supposed to say smash that subscribe button.
Oh, yeah, well, smash it.
Smash it?
Like,
Smash it.
Put your fist right through your computer screen and make sure that you're subscribed and all the like.
Yeah.
Just emphatically.
Emphatically. All right, guys, we are in Matthew chapter 5. We were in the Sermon on the Mount. We got through the Beatitudes, and Jesus talking about how he came to fulfill the law, and it's important to kind of circle back to remember what we were talking about, because Jesus does end what we talked about last episode with these words, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." That's real important for where he's going next.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that really that frames everything that's going to be said, because he's going to basically show you what they have deemed as righteous, and then he's going to show you what real righteousness actually looks like.
Yeah, because you might have the question, right? It'd be like, exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Well, how righteous would I have to be? All you have to do is keep reading, and he's going to break it right down for you.
That's right. So with that by way of introduction, we start at verse 21. It says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says 'you fool' will be liable to the hell of fire. So, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny." Well, no big whoop there, huh, fellas?
That's a lot, man.
And that do not murder anyone is a little easier to keep than that whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. Some people just say, "Hey, Jesus says." I mean, we probably do this too, Scott. Hey, Jesus, when he talks about the law, he doesn't just say that, don't murder, but he says that if you're angry or if you hate someone, that's murder. He actually says a lot more than that. I mean, he doesn't just end there. He says all kinds of stuff. I mean, not only if you're angry, but if you're insulting, if you're calling people fools. I mean, he goes down for a while, and then and even goes so far as to say God isn't even interested in whatever offering you might have if you're angry with your brother. So, this is another way of Jesus saying that you can't appease God in this way, right? So you can't have hatred in your heart towards your neighbor, and then say, "Hey, God, though, here's my bull or my ram or my goat or whatever it is." That God's like, "Nah, I'm not really interested in that."
I think, backing up a little bit, I think it's interesting that he starts out, "You have heard that it was said to those of old," rather than saying, as you know, God gave to Moses the commandment, "You shall not murder." I just think that's interesting. I'm sure that there's some context for that I'm unaware of, but it's just an interesting way to start this out. And it likely has to do with just a reference more to their practices being connected to ancient practices even for them, and kind of going way, 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 way back. But it's an interesting way to start. And he just uses, you shall not murder, uses, as we number it, the fifth commandment.
Yeah.
As the example.
He is, I mean, to your point, Scott, he is actually referencing sort of rabbinic sayings of the time when he says it this way. And it was really, I mean, the way that they interpreted it was basically just the physical act of murder was the problem. And what Jesus, of course, is going on to say here is, no, it's even the seed that sort of leads eventually to murder that is the problem. Like the anger, the hatred towards your brother is what eventually results in the physical act of murder, and that's the problem.
Well, it's progressive too from 22 on, right? So he starts out with in 21 with the commandment, you shall not murder. And then in 22 he goes on, and it shows the progression of how this thing goes in our life when we sort of sin. It starts with an emotion, an internal emotion, one that you maybe can or cannot control. Right? It's very hard to control getting angry with somebody. And I think this is important to point out that you can maybe tell yourself, I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to get angry. And then they say something and you're, automatically angry without really thinking about it. It's a emotional, physical reaction a lot of times. Yeah. I mean, we could spend some time linking that to the bondage of the will, what Christ was actually getting at here. But at the end of the day, it shows the progression of sin. It goes from you were angry, you insulted them, you called him a fool, right? And then you held the anger against him. So it's your insult back to him wasn't even enough for you to sort of satiate the anger. You're angry, you insult him, call him a fool, and you're still angry, and you're still holding it against him. And that is exactly how sin works. Like the sinning isn't even the pressure release valve for the oftentimes, which is weird because you would think in our modern age where they tell you that you just got to, work through your emotions and all that kind of gobbledygook garbage, it implies that once you've worked through it, once you've gotten it out, it's going to be all over. But we all know that's not true. I mean, we all know that's not true. The actual sin that came from the emotion that started the sin is very rarely, if ever, the pressure relief valve for that emotion.
Yeah, well, I was talking about this text a while back, and you're going to get people trying to, usually this happens when someone's trying to justify something, but they say, well, but the Bible does say it is possible to have righteous anger or to be angry and do not sin. Yeah, and
Ephesians.
And I said, but you got to understand that it also is like, yes, it does say like, be angry and sin not. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. So like, how much time are you given to be angry with cause? Well, if you wake up the next morning and you're still angry, you have crossed the line into sin, okay? This is partially why Jesus then says, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you were going with him to court. Like, the idea is that anything that you hold on to is impossible for it not to become sin. Like, someone might do something, you might see something happen that's completely unjust or something, and it might make you angry. But to hold on to offense or anger, you're because of your bound will, because you are a sinner, you are going to cross that line.
Dan,
it's poison.
Just occurred to me that we're planning to record some tough text later this week, which everybody should go subscribe to. It's a great podcast. We should do that text.
Yeah.
Because that is it is one of the most overused texts by people that just want to be jerks to people that they love. And there's got to be that's got to be a special kind of sin to just be a jerk to people that you love and then pull out that, but this is righteous anger. Tell me that you're the perfect judge of your own heart and what is and is not righteous anger. Let me just give you a hint from the Sermon on the Mount here. You're not. Yeah. You're just not. If there's anyone that can judge whether your anger is righteous, it's not you. Period. It's just not. I will judge, given the opportunity, I will judge all of my anger as righteous because I wouldn't be angry if I didn't simply think I was right about everything.
Yeah. Right.
Now, and interestingly enough here, in the progression you talked about, it goes from anger to insult to you fool. There is an interesting connotation when you go back to Greek here. We don't usually do that on this podcast very often, but it's actually the word for you fool was associated with like, you're worth nothing. So it gets to the point where you dehumanize the person. You start thinking of them as less than you, and even maybe like an animal that's worthy of just being cast aside. That is the progression. Like you dehumanize the other person. In other words, you begin to deny that they are a fellow image bearer like you. That's what all this leads to, and that's how murder can be justified by people. And you see this all the time. I mean, you see language like this when wars start all the time. One side has to dehumanize the other.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean he starts with in verse 21 with the ultimate culmination of the progression, right? And then kind of works through it systematically how it starts. And the idea is, especially as you're reading it in the Greek, like you said, Eric, the idea is that this is all referring back to murder.
Yeah. All right, well, I think we've covered that section. Let's move on to verse 27. It says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell."
This is the gospel of the Lord.
Yeah.
That's pretty tough.
Yeah. I mean, so here, this is actually probably this is probably another tough text, Scott. How literally are we supposed to take this? I mean, what is he doing here? Is this prescriptive here? Is this what we're doing? Are we going to say like, all right, if you've ever lusted, out with the eye, off with the hand, we'll just run around blind and amputated, and that maybe will help us. I think that what you're doing here, and obviously we'll get into the how he just obliterated everybody with this this particular message. But going to that part, you got to remember that he's saying, okay, if you're going to get to heaven through your own righteousness, by the law, it has to be better than what the scribes. If this is the way it's going to be, if you have determined that it's going to be your goodness that is going to get you there, then you better start gouging out eyes and cutting off hands. This would be the implication. So a dependency on the law to get you to heaven, it would make total sense for you to say like, well, maybe I'll just gouge my eyes out. I don't want to be going around coveting and lusting and that sort of thing. So it would be better to gouge my eyes out than to be thrown into hell.
Yeah. I mean, this is just like the previous set of verses. This is a wowza. This is, if you ever want to, take a homiletics class on how to preach a law, stop trying to pull gospel out of these sections of the Bible and just let Jesus take you to school on how to proclaim the law to sinners. Because that's what he does here. It's like, adultery is one of those things. I mean, he's pulling out the two big ones, right? If we put up with a lot of sin from each other in day-to-day lives. But the things that even in any society across the world that's very difficult to put up with and still sort of remain intact are murder and adultery or lust, or it's kind of licentiousness to a degree that it breaks down the fabric of society.
They often mingle together, by the way.
Yeah, and they often mingle together. I mean, it's one of the biggest motivations for murder is some sort of weird love thing going on. But so he goes at the two big ones, and in both cases, he's just it's pretty simple what he's doing at the end of the day. It didn't occur to us, right? That's why the Pharisees didn't occur to them. But when God comes down and preaches a law, it occurs to him that the attack isn't just at the outward deed, which is so easy for us to get self-righteous about, because if you haven't committed the outward deed, it's very easy to point a finger at somebody that did and say, I'm better than you, which is what the Pharisees have done. And Jesus comes and just points out that no one, literally no one that has been born and made it, past the age of puberty and probably before has ever made it through You just haven't.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think what he's doing too is that if like it'd be one thing like, okay, so if Jesus went straight to, you have heard it said, do not lie, like people be like, this is one where you'd be like, sure, he could say like, if you've ever even thought about like hiding the truth, or if you've ever like not told the entirety of something, you're a liar. There's a way to amplify that, of course.
Yeah.
But even the Pharisees probably aren't going around saying, I have never told a lie ever in my entire life, right? Or that part of what he's doing is he's taking the two that
The society breakers.
well, yeah, and the two that are like sort of the easiest to say that you've kept, right? So the Pharisees can go around and say like, I haven't done these two.
Right.
And Jesus shows up and says like, actually,
You have.
yeah, you have.
Yeah.
The Sermon on the Mount basically eliminates the ability for anybody to say, well, at least I'm not as bad as this, that, or the other person.
Or to take it back to what Dan originally said, which I think is more important, is that even if you don't think you're earning your way to righteousness before God through, thou shalt not covet, which can be explained away in a sense, and can't be proven outwardly that you've ever committed, unless you've acted on that to the point of theft. You can claim that you are earning righteousness in these two big ones here, murder and adultery. And that we were talking about this before, is like when somebody says you're not doing enough good works, Dan's reaction is, which ones? Well, the which one, at least in lust and adultery, the which one is going to be one of the ones that people typically point out. And it's the funny thing is it's not a good work in a sense. It's the if you're keeping it outwardly, it's the abstinence of a bad work.
Yeah.
And it's not an actively good work. And so even in that case, it doesn't match. But the presupposition that you can earn your salvation via the law is at the end of the day what Christ is breaking down here.
That's right.
He's not just breaking down the individual people. He is breaking, which of course he's doing because he's preaching the law, but he is literally teaching away the presupposition that the law was ever given so that you could go to heaven, so that you could be righteous before God.
Yeah, and he goes to this point, like how you can go to here. How bad is sin? Well, it's bad enough that if gouging out your eyes and cutting off your hands could prevent you from being a sinner, it would be worth doing. Now, unfortunately, it won't. But if it would, it's worth it.
Yeah, you should do it.
Yeah, and just one thing to point out here is there were people in fairly early in the church's history that tried to take Jesus literally here about what to do to counter their lust. There were people that castrated themselves. There were people that cut off parts of their body. And what they found out very quickly is that did not cure them of lust.
No.
Well, the entire SE movement and then the entire, eventual movement of people becoming monks and nuns and
the hermits.
At the end of the day is an attempt to control your passion by removing yourself from the world.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, that didn't work.
Well, it's not understanding that the problem is not out there; it's in here.
Yeah,
right.
and that is what Jesus is eventually going to point out.
Yeah.
Like he's eventually going to point out that the heart is the real problem.
Yes.
Yeah, hard to escape that. Hard to monk your way out of that.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. So he continues on in verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, just key context here, of course, at that time, there were really kind of two overarching schools of thought about what made divorce permissible. But the bottom line with both of the views is that basically it was almost like a death sentence for a wife if she was to be divorced back then. They didn't have any sort of security, welfare systems in place to make sure that she would be taken care of. She was basically left on her own. And the reasons that made divorce allowable for, quite a few people that followed particular rabbis were things like, if she's burnt the dinner. That's real.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
they were like, hey, if she burnt dinner, you have the right, oh man, to divorce that wife who cooked you such a bad meal. And so keeping that in mind, what Jesus says here about divorce is they've been way too lenient about what makes divorce okay. And this actually was a protection to the women back then.
Yeah, well, the idea here is that Moses, and Jesus will say this later on, but Moses said, okay, if you're gonna leave your wife, you have to like give her a certificate of divorce so that she can show that she is available, that she is like now single, right?
Yeah, Jesus clears this one up a little later in Matthew 19.
Yeah. And this is only done because only allowed, Jesus says, because of the hardness of people's hearts. In other words, they were going to do it anyway, so God comes in through Moses and puts in a system to make this be done as properly as possible because people are going to do it anyway. And if you'll notice, as Jesus is talking about this, the reason he's saying, like, look, you can't be doing this divorce for whatever reason you feel like thing. There's one reason, and then he does this thing. But anyone who divorces his wife except for on the grounds of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. It does. Like you could tell that Jesus here is still concerned about the woman in this thing when it comes to divorce. He's not like, and then whoever does this man might go out there and do this other thing or anything like that. He's saying that because women weren't initiating divorces at this point, okay? Like, that's not how this works. So divorce is like all, except for unless she steps out on you or something, divorce is a strictly male-initiated thing, and so he's going hard after the dudes right here, saying, you're putting women in, like, these situations, which, of course, is not only a sin to divorce your wife for no cause, but also sin on top of sin because now you're placing her in these positions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one is interesting to me. I mean, in our modern context, not as many divorces marriages end up in divorce now as they did even 20 years ago, but still in our modern context, it's a fairly common thing and taken pretty lightly on the whole. And so it's, again, there's two parts to this. There's this part where he's seemingly giving a permissible reason for divorce, and then there's when he's asked a question about it in Matthew 19, how he really clears up the fact that divorce was never intended. Is at the end of the day.
That's right.
And when in our attempts to hold tight to the law by saying, well, I really can though if there's some sexual immorality. Even at that point, what Jesus points out later is that even at that point, Moses allowed that because your hearts were hard, and you wouldn't let this woman. You would let this woman that you once loved go without any means of taking care of herself. The whole point of this is to point out that you're not going to live up to this one, and even if you do, it's not intended for your righteousness because there's nothing righteous about this in here.
Right.
There is only, a small semblance of protection. And sinful semblance of protection.
Well, why is the protection there? The protection has to be there because of sin.
Correct.
I mean, sin is the thing that necessitated there be some sort of protection put in place.
And I think it's important to note as we move on that the next section is directly relevant to what he just said about marriage and divorce. And sometimes the headings in our Bibles, Dan and I have pointed this out many, many times. Sometimes they're placed there to be helpful, but they end up breaking up the context a little bit.
Yeah,
if you just read it straight through,
it's the section before it.
What's that?
It belongs with the section before it.
Yeah, it's all cut. It's all pieced together. It's all one sermon, and just important to remember that. And so he says right after this statement about divorce, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So with the context here, I mean, it's pretty clear what Jesus is saying is that last statement is really the summation of this. Like, don't be double-minded. Don't be double-tongued, to quote James. But let your yes be yes and let your no be no. and be a person of integrity that actually does what you say you're going to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that if you're talking about righteousness through the law, if you were a truly righteous person, you wouldn't have to swear by anything. Like,
Yeah.
all you'd have to do is say it, right?
Amen.
That's
I mean,
right.
Like this would be how it was. So if I was perfect, as my Heavenly Father is perfect, I wouldn't have to swear by anything. If I said, I promise, that's all you need, because I'm walking around here with no reason for you to ever question that I wasn't going to do what I said I would do.
Yeah. Your word is your word at that
Yep.
point. No one ever asked Jesus to, swear in a stack of Bibles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, and to that end, I mean, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the whole religious establishment at that time, were indeed making oaths on all sorts of things.
Correct. Yeah.
On the altar, on the temple, on this and that,
On
as a
Jerusalem,
way to
the
back up
city
their
of the
word.
great
And
king.
Jesus just basically says, hey, if you guys were actually people of integrity, you wouldn't need to swear on anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
imagine swearing by Washington, D.C.? I swear by Washington, D.C. that I am telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I don't
Said
think
every
that would create
politician.
much trust, Scott.
Yeah.
That's the extent of our political commentary for this episode.
Sorry.
So lastly, Jesus says in verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Now, let me just say, guys, what he said right here is not really what he meant, okay? How many times have you heard somebody try to get out of what he just said here? You can't get out from under these words. They are what they are. They say what they say. And they are meant to do the exact same thing that all the other words have done so far, which is to show you just how sinful and messed up you are.
Remember when I said Jesus is taking us to school on how to preach the law?
That's right.
Welcome to class.
That's right.
Like, this is what this is. There's no way around this, because this is not going to be anybody's inclination whatsoever, ever.
And
This isn't even a child's inclination, let alone a grown adult who's been dealing with conflict their whole life. This is anti-inclinational, and this is why this is a good lesson on the bondage of the will. This is showing, and we've referenced it, but let me just say what I mean. This is showing that your will, you cannot control your will, right? That is bound. It's bound by your sin, and so you also cannot get out of the preaching of thusly get out of the preaching of the law. And so when he says to you, if someone smacks you in the face on your one cheek, give them the other cheek, and you say, that's insane, right? That's because according to your sinful will, it is absolutely insane to do that. And it would never occur to you to even listen to that advice, even if given to you by God. And so you hear that and you think, that is ridiculous. I am never going to keep that law. And you're not. This is just showing that that's what the preaching of the law does. It is making you face the fact that you are wholly sinful in thought, word, and deed.
Yeah.
Well, it's painting a picture of a righteous person that even confounds what you think of when you think of a righteous person. Because what Jesus says is that if you were truly righteous, you wouldn't even worry about suffering injustice.
Right. Or your money.
Well,
But
and
you
to that end,
you wouldn't worry about it. Like,
there-
you'd be
there
like, oh,
is-
Your clothes, your money, your righteousness, your justice, none of it, you wouldn't care about any of it.
to that end, I mean, we can say this: there is one person who actually does live like this. It is his inclination, and that is Jesus alone, and that is why we desperately need to be covered in his righteousness, because he actually did do this, because we do not.
Wait, he's the only person born after Adam and Eve were created who was born with a will that is not bound
That's exactly right.
by sin.
yeah, because you do see Jesus struck in the face and literally offer the other cheek.
Well, I mean, as you guys pointed out last week, the verse 41 refers to what Romans could demand of non-Romans, right?
Right.
A Roman
Yeah.
could walk up to you and say, hey, carry my stuff for a mile. And you'd have to. If you were in a part of the world that was occupied by Rome and you were not a Roman citizen, you'd have to. And he says, go 2 miles. Now, this is the only guy living in a part of the world that's occupied by the Romans, who could call down heaven and all its angels on the Roman that required that of him. Right? He's saying this, I'm the only person that could do anything about this and get away with it. And I'm telling you to go too.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's
Amen.
guys. We got to pause right there. We are out of time. And Jesus is going to say something that has to do directly with this, and tell us to do the thing that just like nobody wants to do this. And if you're wondering if Jesus is a little bit talking about himself in conjunction with what you ought to be, well, this next part is going to make it pretty clear that that's exactly what's going on here. But we'll have to wait until next week for that. I'll see you guys then.
All right, sounds good.